Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly review show with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, how are you doing?
Very well, Nassim. Hope always good to be with you, and hope you're well also.
I'm fine, thank you, thank you. Lots to get through. As always, we'll begin with Gaza. A new report that's just been published by Lancet, which found that the death toll is actually underestimated by as much as 41%. I want to get your thoughts on that. A US academic institution which has accused Israel of scholasticide. So we'll look into what that means and what they have and what that vote means as well. Then we'll turn our attention to Lebanon, where a new president and prime minister have been elected. And then I want to get your thoughts on a story that's developing. It's not been covered very much by the mainstream media, which is alleged buildup of troops, Egyptian troops in the Sinai, and that's causing backlash in Israel. Is that a threat to the 1979 Israel-Egypt Normalization Treaty? And then we'll turn our attention to the US, Congress sanctioning the International Criminal Court rift between Trump and Netanyahu, or it seems to be a rift between Trump and Netanyahu. And then we'll end with Biden's legacy. By the time the next show comes up, Biden would have left, and Trump would have been appointed as would become the new president of the US. Which is why I wanted to get your thoughts on what is Biden's legacy, and then with that. But let's begin, as I mentioned, with a new report by the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, which estimated that as much as around 65,000 people may have been killed, which suggests that the Gaza Health Ministry has actually underestimated the death toll by as much as 41%, which is quite a significant report, given that for a year now we've been told that this is a Gaza-run health ministry, and not only that, there'll be so many pro-Israeli propagandists would be brought in front of our TVs to say that the so-called militant to civilian death toll in Gaza is the lowest in modern history. So there's been a huge propaganda psyops, I would say, that's been conducted to suppress the figures. And it seems like this prestigious journal has now come along and said that it's been underestimated by as much as 41%.
Yes, it's a very significant and, as one would expect, in the Lancet, also a very well researched article. I think by four or five specialists associated with leading institutions such as London Institute for Tropical Medicine, Yale University, and others. And it's, of course, also a peer-reviewed study, which is quite different than the drivel being put out by some of these charlatans that you've referred to. We've had recently reports by disinformation practitioner named Andrew Fox, writing for the radical right-wing Henry Jackson Society. I think we discussed the report a few weeks ago, basically inventing all these fabrications about how Palestinians have deliberately inflated the death toll from Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. And then you have other Israel flunkies, such as a guy named John Spencer, who keeps trumpeting that, this is the most discriminate armed campaign in military history, and so on. And I suspect he may not even be paid to do this, but he's doing it out of pure devotion and conviction to this genocide. But getting back to the Lancet, so this study looked in detail at the statistics and details put forward by the Gaza Ministry of Health. And it then also compared them to other sources, such as obituaries on social media, media reports that contain identification details, and so on. And it found that the Gaza Ministry of Health's criteria for the identification of casualties is, in effect, so strict that it is not reporting many other deaths that could be verified. And it came to the conclusion that the additional deaths that are not being officially reported would increase deaths due to what I think it called traumatic injury between October 2023 and June of 2024. It would increase it by 40%. So, in other words, there are 40% more violent deaths than are being reported by the Gaza Health Ministry. So, this then raises additional questions. One would also need to add all the indirect deaths to this tally, such as those who are dying because of lack of medication, for example, people with chronic conditions, people who have people who have received injuries that under normal circumstances would be easily treatable, people who can no longer get emergency or first aid care for non-conflict related injuries, but are unable to get that care because of the conflict. So it not only puts the lie to this posse of charlatans who have been going out of their way, basically an orchestrated campaign of genocide denial during the past 15 months, but it also makes clear that, if anything, the Gaza Ministry of Health is being too careful and is underreporting the casualties in the Gaza Strip during the past year.
Yes, and we should add that the Lancet very early on published another report saying that the death toll could be as much as, I think it was 183,000 when war comes to an end. We don't, of course, know exactly when the genocidal campaign will
Yes,
come to an
if I
end.
could just respond to that earlier submission in the Lancet that you're referring to was actually a letter written by a number of scholars, and it took a much more expansive view of casualties that can be attributed to Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip, such as these indirect deaths that I was just referring to. And that was published as a letter to the editor, if I'm not mistaken, of the Lancet. Now, the Lancet is obviously very careful about which letters it chooses to publish and not publish. But another difference is that this latest article that we're discussing today is actually a proper article that was peer-reviewed and that passed the entire scholarly apparatus for publication in what is arguably the world's most prestigious medical journal.
And the kind of death toll we're talking about are the kind of death toll we'd expect in a genocide. And there was an interesting vote in the US last week by the American Historical Association. That's, again, another prestigious academic institution, which looked at, I would say, a subset of genocide, which is scholasticide, the destruction of schools, universities, and the vote was 428 to 82. I just want to get your thoughts on that. I mean, as I mentioned, for me, when people mention scholasticide, that to me is a subset of genocide. It suggests that there is a genocide taking place, as well as other forms of sides were memoricide, ethnocide, politicide. I think Palestinians have been subjected to all those forms of subsets of genocide.
Yes, I mean, the American Historical Association is actually the oldest learned association, the oldest scholarly association in the United States. It was during the Vietnam War, for example, had nothing to say. It was controlled by kind of establishment historians, conservative, pro-government, and so on. Became a bit more vocal during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And now, thanks to the ceaseless efforts by a number of very active historians in the association, you've had this resolution adopted at its most recent meeting, as you know, more than 400 for, less than 100 against. Yet the New York Times chose to publish an opinion piece basically questioning why this resolution had to be adopted at all, rather than pointing out the significance of what just happened. And I think this resolution is important for two reasons. The first is that it very clearly, as you mentioned, it identifies scholasticide and what it refers to as basically the deliberate eradication of the educational infrastructure and educational system in the Gaza Strip, including the premeditated and systematic and total destruction of every university in the Gaza Strip. But it also ties this directly to the U.S. role in supporting Israel in being able to carry out the scholasticide and providing cover for it. So, given that it's an American association, I think drawing a relationship between what is happening in the Gaza Strip and the active complicity of U.S. policy is also very important. So this resolution, which has been adopted, now goes to the leadership of the American Historical Association, which apparently has a discretion to either accept it, reject it, or submit it to the full membership of the association, more than 10,000 members, to decide what to do. My understanding is that there are quite significant concerns about the current leadership of the AHA. The president, for example, is said to have been against the adoption of this resolution. And no doubt, there will be the typical machinations to try to repeal this this resolution or prevent it from becoming a formal resolution by the association. But, we'll see how that struggle plays out in the weeks and months ahead.
Let's turn our attention to the negotiations that's taking place. Trump, of course, mentioned that he wants this wrapped up before January 20th. January 20th is a week away. Where are we with that? There are reports that both sides have been given the final draft of a breakthrough, and I quote, very, very close to a deal. I mean, where are we with the negotiations for a ceasefire?
Well, if you look at the news reports, all indications are that an agreement is imminent and may well be signed between the time we're having this discussion on Sunday, rather on Monday, and the time it's broadcast on Tuesday. I think there are important factors that would seem to be promoting a speedy resolution of this issue. The most important of which is Trump's repeated demands that there be an agreement and that this file be closed before he assumes office on the 20th of January. Now, many people have interpreted that as a direct threat against Hamas of all hell to pay if they don't capitulate and accept Israel's conditions. I think it's actually a little more complex than that. The reason being that there's not much that the U.S., or for that matter, Israel, can threaten Hamas with, can threaten the Palestinians with, that they haven't already done. I mean, when you've engaged in genocide for almost a year and a half, when you have essentially prohibited the entry of even the minimum numbers of food and medicines and water into the Gaza Strip, really the only thing that they can threaten the Palestinians with is a total shutoff of any water, of any food coming in. And that wouldn't be such a huge step compared to what is already going on. Are they going to drop more bombs? They've already reduced the entire Gaza Strip to rubble. So I would argue that these threats by Trump are also in part a camouflage for pressure, persuasion, whatever you want to call it, that's also being directed at the Israeli government, and specifically Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, of we want this done. We do not want to enter office with what is seen in the United States as a hostage crisis. We want it off our plates before we start eating. And of course, the Biden administration would very much like to have this achievement as well, before it leaves office. But I think that's a much less important factor because the Biden administration has repeatedly demonstrated over the past year and a half that it is not willing to use any of the leverage it has to promote such an agreement and is content to let Netanyahu sabotage it, run circles around Washington, and to then blame Hamas for the lack of progress. But what we have now is apparently a final draft. We've seen a real intensification of Israeli bombings in the Gaza Strip, which could well be a signal that there is about to be an agreement. Hamas has demonstrated some flexibility, apparently, against the staging of this three-part agreement. In other words, how the three stages relate to each other. And the Kadura Faris, who is responsible for the prisoner file in the Palestinian Authority, is said to have arrived in the Qatari capital, Doha, to also discuss the release of which Palestinian prisoners and administrative detainees and hostages will be released in any exchange. Just to recall, the three key issues are whether Israel will commit to a formal end to the war, whether Israel will commit to a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and whether and the nature of any exchange of captives and hostages between Israel and the Gaza Strip. The last one, I think, is complicated because Hamas is insisting that a number of the most prominent Palestinian prisoners in Israeli custody, such as Marwan Barghouti, the Fatah leader, such as the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Ahmed Saadat, and others, be included at the outset of any exchange. Not only is Israel opposed to this, but the Palestinian Authority is perhaps even more opposed to these people being released from Israeli prison than Israel are, because it views them as a potential political threat to its own position. But you know, there's lots of rumors flying. There does appear to be very serious movement towards an end game. I think we can safely ignore much of the noise. And particularly, you know, Netanyahu's insistence that part of any deal has to include Israel's right to resume its genocidal campaign once it retrieves its captives and hostages from the Gaza Strip. Clearly, that's not anything that Hamas is prepared to accept. But what an agreement will actually look like, whether it will be the agreement that sets the tone of implementation, or whether then there, as in Lebanon, there also a bilateral U.S.-Israeli agreement that, as far as the U.S. and Israel takes precedence over any formal agreement. Those are things we'll have to see.
Yeah, let's wait and see how much of an impact Trump actually has. And we have been, as you mentioned here before, very, very close to a deal, and it never materialized. Partly, as we've discussed many times on this show, because of Israeli intransigence. You know, Israel moving the goalpost over and over again. So let's wait and see if Trump can make the difference. Many suspect he may. Let's move on to the wider region. And I want to start with Lebanon, where a new president has been elected last week, Joseph Aoun. And the latest is that they have also appointed a new prime minister, or elected a new prime minister, Nawaf Salam. Nawaf Salam is the presiding judge at the ICJ, International Court of Justice. So just two questions, really. I mean, is this going to weaken Hezbollah? And also, who will replace Salam at the ICJ?
Well, let's turn to the presidency first, and the election of Joseph Aoun as president of the country. By the way, Joseph Aoun is no relation to his predecessor, Michel Aoun. But Joseph Aoun's election is seen as a achievement for the United States, for France, and for Saudi Arabia, and is seen as a defeat for not only Hezbollah, but also for Iran. Having said that, the according to the Lebanese informal constitution, the president must be a Maronite Christian and is elected by parliament rather than by popular vote. And in the first vote for a president, Hezbollah and Amal's members of parliament cast blank ballots or abstained, and thereby on did not have sufficient votes to be elected president. And then only, I believe, in the second round did they vote for him. So it was a defeat for them in the sense that he was not their preferred candidate, and their preferred candidate, Suleiman Frangieh, withdrew. But they were also able to demonstrate that he was only elected because of their consent, ultimate consent. Turning to the premiership, also according to Lebanese constitutional tradition, if you will, the prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim. And here again, it's my understanding that Hezbollah's preferred candidate is the current acting prime minister, Najib Mikati. But in effect, what has happened on today, Monday, the 13th of January, is that Nawaf Salam has been appointed to this post and is said to be arriving in Beirut imminently to take up his appointment. So this has implications both, I think, for Lebanese politics, which we've discussed, but it also has implications for the International Court of Justice, because not only was Saddam a judge at the ICJ, he was also the president of the court. And with his absence, his post as president of the ICJ is now going to be filled by his deputy, the vice president, who is none other than the Ugandan judge, Sebutinde, who's kind of made a name for herself during the past year for her fanatic devotion to anything and everything Israeli. So she will now be the presiding judge at the court, at least until a new judge is elected to replace Salam on the court. What I'm less clear about is whether the newly constituted 15-judge court will then elect a new president and vice president, or whether Sebutinde will remain president for the remainder of Saddam's term. He was appointed president or elected president by the judges only last year and still has 2 years left in his term. So, all these moving parts, quite interesting, particularly with respect to Sebutinde, who is really completely off the charts and is apparently a member of some fanatic Christian cult. And the scholar Norman Finkelstein has done very extensive and detailed research into her record and her statements as judge. I think his research should be appearing soon, and it casts very, very, very serious questions about her professional integrity.
And turning to Egypt, it's an issue we've not discussed previously. There's been a lot of reports in Israeli sources speaking of and build-up of Egyptian troops within the Sinai Peninsula. And as we know, Egypt and Israel normalized relationship in 1979, and there's details about how many troops can enter into Sinai. So the Israelis are now seem to be on another war front with the Egyptians, not Israelis, a number of Israeli commentators and officials, I should say. The far-right heritage minister, he's been very vocal, and he's come out and said that we should reoccupy Sinai if Egyptians push their troops out into the peninsula. So are these just scare stories, or should we take them quite seriously?
Well, I think at this stage, anytime you hear an Israeli official saying something that's off the wall, it's not very intelligent to simply dismiss it out of hand because you never know with it's a political structure that has become so irrational that really anything is possible. Regarding Egypt, as you know, the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty divided the Sinai into three zones, A, B, and C, with each one having different levels of armed forces and weaponry that is permitted in those zones. And then there's also a zone D, which is on the Gaza and Israeli side of the border, because in 1979 or in 1981-82, when Israel completed its withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip was still under direct Israeli occupation, and Israel controlled that side of the border. So the treaty also placed limits on what Israel could on Israeli armed forces on the other side of the border. What happened in the past decade is that after General Sisi seized power in Egypt in the 2013 military coup and an insurgency broke out in the Sinai Peninsula, the Egyptians went to the Israelis and requested an increase in the number of soldiers and weapons that they could deploy in the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis agreed to this. There are even reports also that the Israeli Air Force carried out airstrikes in the Sinai Peninsula on Egypt's behalf and at Egypt's request during this period. So the Egyptians initially acted with Israeli consent. And there are indications that the Egyptians then went beyond what the Israelis had agreed to and also did not withdraw the extra troops and weaponry in line with the time frame that they had communicated to the Israelis. That seems to be the case. I don't have that confirmed. And now you have the Israelis on their side of the border in Zone D, also deploying troops and weapons in excess of what is permitted by the peace treaty with Egypt, with the difference, if I understand correctly, that the Israelis did not seek Egypt's consent before acting. I think they simply either did it or informed the Egyptians and then did whatever they wanted to do. So this created quite a bit of friction between the Egyptians and the Israelis. Now, if you look at these latest Israeli statements, I think, it's potentially setting up a pretext for any military action that the Israelis may choose to take in Egyptian Sinai, if there is renewed instability with Egypt or whatever. It's really difficult to say what precisely the motivations are. But also bearing in mind that for Israel, the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to the Sinai Peninsula does remain on its wish list.
Mhm. Uh, I mean, this kind of talk of annexation by Israel, it's become quite a pattern over the last couple of weeks and months. And the Sinai Peninsula isn't the only area where Israeli ministers and politicians are speaking about annexing. The Jerusalem Post published an article suggesting Israel should annex all of Mount Hermon, which is in Syria. And the Israeli Minister of Construction, Yitzhak Goldunov, he said that 1 million Jews should be transferred to the occupied West Bank. So with all this talk of annexation, the UAE published a letter saying that it condemns talks by Israeli officials and Israeli accounts on social media, talking about the annexation of various parts of the occupied West Bank, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. So, as you mentioned, we shouldn't take this lightly and just dismiss it as just the talk of some crazy individuals within Israel. There's a serious move, it seems, given that the UAE itself has come out and condemned this kind of talk. So we should take this seriously.
Yes, I mean, the Lebensraum faction in Israeli politics is clearly dominant and in the ascendant. You know, they want to settle the Gaza Strip, they want to annex additional portions of Syria, they want to annex the West Bank, they want to move 1 million new settlers into that territory. They're making sounds about Sinai. They want even some who want to uh, promote settlement in southern Lebanon. So it really is the Lebensraum faction with very very similar motivations and rationales and justifications for their policies. And I completely agree with you. You dismiss this as the meaningless ravings of marginal lunatics at your peril, because there's a history here, and therefore such statements should be taken seriously. But unfortunately, they very rarely are.
Hmm. Let's turn our attention to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, as predicted, Poland has said that it will give Netanyahu permission to attend the memorial at Auschwitz. And let me just get your thoughts on that. I mean, I've been watching a lot of videos and also reading a lot of content predicting what could happen in 2025. And one of the theme that's quite consistent with every single video I watch and articles I read is that 2025 will be the year we will see more and more pressure on international multilateral organizations like the ICC, like the ICJ, and what we know as the rules-based order set up after the Second World War will, if not collapse, will come under a lot of strain, and it will be returned to the rule of the jungle. So this seems to be Poland's decision to give Netanyahu immunity. Seems to be another example of where we are entering into the rule of headed towards the rule of the jungle.
Well, weaponizing the Holocaust to promote war crimes. It's there in plain sight. And what's interesting here is that this is not a decision being taken by the far right party that has played such an important role in Polish politics during the past decade or two. This is based on a statement by Donald Tusk, who was the European Union's what was he, president, I think,
That's right, yeah.
until 5 or 6 years ago. So this is someone who basically campaigned in the most recent Polish elections about the importance of the rule of law and that he would restore rule of law to its rightful place, and is now working overtime to destroy the rule of law. Not only in Poland, which has very clear and unambiguous responsibilities towards the International Criminal Court, of which it is a member, but it is also a frontal attack on the entire international legal order. And yes, it's the Americans who, as one might expect, are yelling the loudest at 1,000 decibels about destroying the ICC and everything else. But I think there's quite a few Europeans, like Donald Tusk in Poland, who would be quite happy to see the ICC tossed into the dustbin of history as well. As far as such people are concerned, the ICC has served its purpose. It's put the Africans in their place. It has indicted Vladimir Putin. It's done what, from their point of view, it was created to do. But now that it's beginning to act as if it also has a mandate, to go after Israelis and potentially even Europeans, well, let's get rid of it. And I think Tusk knows exactly what he's doing. Tusk cannot but know the implications of his statement for the legitimacy of the ICC, for the future of the ICC, how it strengthens the Western campaign against the ICC. And look, it may well be that Tusk and Netanyahu reached an informal agreement that, if Tusk makes this statement, Netanyahu won't come. And so this issue won't arise. But I think we should focus not on whether Netanyahu will or will not go to Poland, not on whether Poland, in such a eventuality, will or will not arrest him. I think the mere fact that someone of Tusk's prominence made such a statement tells you all you need to know.
I mean, we should point out that the Europeans haven't sanctioned the ICC, while the Americans last week, as we spoke earlier, have decided to sanction the International Criminal Court. How would they go about doing that, though? I mean, most of the $200 million budget for the ICC comes from the top four donors, as far as I know, is Japan, Germany, France, and the UK. So the UK has passed a resolution saying that it will sanction the ICC. So what can it do? I mean, to add to that, I mean, that in itself has become quite a story in the US. Maybe I can get your comments on that as well. A number of commentators and also members of Congress have come out strongly against the bill, saying that while there's fires in California, burning homes and houses, the priority the US set for itself is to sanction the ICC without addressing the fires in California. So that was a stark image for a lot of people that
Yes.
priority number one for this new government is to sanction the ICC when there's so many other challenges in the US.
Yes, and that's the way the U.S. Congress has always worked. It's California is burning to the Los Angeles is burning to the ground, and they're preoccupied with the ICC and protecting Israel. A month from now, their preoccupation will be defending insurance companies who are refusing to pay out any claims to those affected by the LA fires. But look, here it's also, I think, instructive. It shows you the differences between the Americans and the Europeans. The Americans have basically decided to drop a nuclear bomb on the ICC. Europeans, by contrast, Tusk being a perfect example, will talk about the importance of international law, the sanctity of the ICC, make all these noises, and then say, actually, Benjamin Netanyahu, the indicted war criminal, the international fugitive from justice, is most welcome to come visit Poland, and then they will instrumentalize the Holocaust and Auschwitz as a pretext, as camouflage with which to stab the ICC in the back, and that's the difference. What the Americans are basically doing, it's extremely serious. They will essentially sanction every individual who works for the court, whether it's an official or a clerk or whatever, in addition to anyone who lends assistance to the court. So any human rights organization, for example, that provides, or any organization that provides services to the court, any human rights organization or individual that provides an affidavit to the court to allow it to do its work. All of those are potential targets. And what it means is that, for example, if you are sanctioned, your bank probably won't touch you with a barge pole anymore because the U.S. controls all transactions conducted in dollars, and it will become illegal for any bank to conduct business with you. So it's a very serious threat that has a potential to affect not only the court, but everyone who works for it and everyone associated with the court, and regardless of the nature of that association.
Yeah, and presumably now anyone that's been working with the ICC will be thinking twice about their
Yes.
cooperation with the ICC. So that's, it's quite a quite a big threat. Let's turn our attention to Trump and also end with a discussion about Joe Biden. Trump, I mean, last week he tweeted a video of Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is a very strong critic of Israel. And that particular video is where he describes Netanyahu as a, and I quote, deep, dark son of a bitch. And then he goes on to basically argue that the US has been fighting Israel's war since many decades, and says that the invasion of 2003 of Iraq was really done at the behest of Benjamin Netanyahu. So that's the video Trump tweeted, and a lot of people were shocked by that. You mentioned earlier that we shouldn't simply think of Trump's threat as a threat to the Palestinians. Again, this reinforces what you were saying. So, what is he trying to communicate by sharing a video of someone like Jeffrey Sachs, who condemns Israel, condemns Netanyahu, and says that the US is simply doing Israel's bidding?
Well, again, as with everything Trump, it's impossible to say. Was it Trump who posted this video? Um, uh, did Trump ask for this video to be posted? Did someone else post it on his behalf, with or without his knowledge? Was this intended as kind of a subtle message to Netanyahu? We told you we want the deal done before we enter the White House. Or, was someone playing a prank, which with Trump is also conceivable. I would really hesitate to draw any conclusion based on this incident, because again, we don't know who's responsible. We don't know to what extent this was authorized or encouraged or demanded by Trump. And even if so, we don't know for what reason or to what end. Yes, this is something you would never see in the Biden administration. They would probably have videos of expressing eternal love and blind devotion to Netanyahu. But I'm hesitant to draw any political conclusions based on the incident you've raised.
So, so as we now end our conversation this week with a review of Biden's record, would you not say that Trump is not wedded ideologically to Zionism in the way, say, for example, Biden has been? Biden is more committed to the idea of Zionism, and Trump is more of a transactional president, as we are led to believe, and it seems to be the case as well. So how would you review Biden's, not his legacy, but his at least last 14 years and the decisions he's made? I mean, his US Andrew Miller, who is the former member of the Biden official, he said that the failure to curb Israel's disproportionate use of force in Gaza, he lays that primarily on Biden's feet. So how would you review his presidency in the last 15 months in particular?
Well, let's focus, I think, on the Middle East, and I think what we've learned is that what we've been experiencing during the past 15 months in the Middle East is as much an American war as an Israeli war. Biden quite clearly, to the extent that it's justified to speak of him as a conscious individual these past few months, took a decision that there will be absolutely no restraints placed on Israel. There will be absolutely no significant demands made on Israel. There will be absolutely no effort made to use Washington's extraordinary leverage over Israel to modify its behavior in any way whatsoever. And it's, to me, simply inconceivable that any previous president, whether Democrat or Republican, and that, by the way, includes Donald Trump, would have conducted themselves identically to Biden during this past year and a half. Quite clearly, he is thoroughly invested in the Israeli project. He's not only someone who has, on repeated occasions over the years, openly declared himself to be a Zionist. But also, when speaking about this issue from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. national security interests, has also on repeated occasions said, if Israel didn't exist, the U.S. would have to invent it. So this is someone who is very, very deeply, personally, passionately invested in Israel. I think it would be wrong not to also overlook the very deep-seated racism that is endemic to politicians of his generation, and particularly of his political background and so on. And so, obviously, this genocide that we have now been discussing for so long could not have happened without Biden. And there's even an argument to be made, I think, that it may not have happened had Biden not been the president of the US. And it's certainly the case, I think, that it would never have achieved the level and dimensions that it has were it not for Biden. There's not many examples, I think, where an individual plays an important role in history. But in this case, Biden does play that role, and it is one of absolute, unadulterated, diabolical evil.
Would you then lay the blame for the US model of global hegemony and
Excuse me, could you repeat
the
that?
US model of global hegemony, which we understand to mean a global hegemony based on the rules-based system set up after the Second World War? Would you lay the blame, because we spoke about that earlier, at the feet of people like Biden, people like Obama, as some do? Trump they see as a consequence of people like presidents like Biden and Obama. There is, of course, returning to the rule of the jungle. It's not going to harm the US. US is a superpower. It's not going to really be concerning US citizens. But there was at least a story that was told, which is that the US form of hegemony is not the rule of the jungle. We will allow everyone to prosper. We will rule through. We will govern through a rules-based system. We will govern through in a manner which allows everyone to succeed and prosper. So has this idea completely been destroyed, not by Trump, but by people like Biden,
Well, yeah,
liberals like
I
Obama?
think Trump is a beneficiary, but the destruction, as you point out, has been done by the Democrats themselves. And Matt Duss has a very interesting article out. I'm trying to remember the name of the publication where it is, but it should be easy to find online. Basically, pointing out how the Democrats have become the war party, and particularly during the Biden administration. And in the process of doing so, they have, ironically enough, made someone this collection of warmongers that are collected around Trump seem like the more reasonable and level-headed crew in this thing. You're now going to have Sullivan, Blinken, McGurk going on victory tours, talking about what an extraordinary job they've done over the past 4 years, and throwing all kinds of javelins at their successors. But let's see what happens in the next few days, because if there is an agreement regarding the Gaza Strip, and if it does end the war, and if it does lead to an Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and if it does lead to an exchange of captives and hostages, let's be absolutely clear. The credit for that, whether you like it or not, will need to go, to the extent that that credit is American, will need to go to Trump, and absolutely not to Biden, who at any point during the past year and a half could have achieved this agreement, but has made a deliberate choice not to.
Thank you, Mouin. That wraps up our episode for this week. As ever, it's always a pleasure to listen to your thoughts and insights on the Middle East
Thank you.
and the world at large. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me, Nassim Ahmed, for our weekly review show for the Middle East Monitor. Thank you and bye-bye.